the atomic bomb provided a quick solution to the war when none seemed possible at the time. The Americans were facing multiple challenges in accomplishing the kind of victory they desired over Japan. And as Joe pointed out, that was the result of Japanese strategy, which was to fight this war of attrition. And they hoped to inflict enough casualties to drag the war out long enough that it would break American morale and get the Americans to the point where they would be willing to negotiate. And that perhaps the Japanese could maintain part of their empire. They could maintain the prerogatives of the emperor. And so that was their objective from about 1944 on, the summer of 44. And it wasn't just Japanese resistance, the bloodletting that affected American strategy and American home front. It was the strain that was being placed on the American economy and the problems that Americans were having providing this necessary manpower in the Pacific, and the logistical challenges they faced in mounting an invasion of Japan thousands of miles from the west coast of the United States. And I do have a map here, which I always like to show because it's a sort of, you know, the idea of one picture is worth 1,000 words. And if you look at this map, you'll notice that's MacArthur's theater. And Hawaii's not even on that map, let alone the west coast of the United States. And of course, Japan.
Mark, it didn't show up. You want to try it again?
Yeah, I've got it on there. What do I need to do?
So when you hit share and then.
Okay. Oh, okay. All right. I got it. Okay. I thought you would be the one who did the share.
Yeah, no,
Can you see it now?
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
Yeah, that, you know, you can just sort of take that in for a second. You get an idea of what's involved in supplying troops across such huge distances. And keep in mind that really once you got sort of north of Australia and west of Hawaii, you really didn't have any modern harbors, you know, to use to resupply ships. And the Navy had to figure out how to supply at sea, and they were going to use the Philippines, Manila, as one of the main bases for the invasion of the Japanese home islands. But the city of Manila itself had been devastated during the campaign to retake the Philippine Islands, and the harbor was clogged with deliberately sunk Japanese ships. And so logistically, it was going to be a massive challenge for the Americans to launch this invasion. Now, on top of that, the Americans had manpower problems. When the United States declared victory over Germany, when Germany surrendered.
Do you still want the map up, Mark? Or should
we could take it down. Do you want me to?
Yeah, I got it. Yep.
Okay. When the United States compelled Germany's surrender in early May, that kickstarted this partial demobilization program that the Army had committed to, where it was going to start demobilizing soldiers who had achieved a certain level of points, which they had earned either through time and service and valor. The threshold was 85 at that point. And that meant that experienced troops were going to be culled from a lot of the units that were at that point in Europe, but also in the Pacific. And as General Marshall pointed out, he said it was like we were losing our first team. And so we're breaking up this unit cohesiveness and trying to reorganize units in order to ship them from Europe all the way across the Pacific. They would go across the United States and then be sent out to to the Pacific. Actually, my co-author in for Implacable Foes, Waldo Heinrichs, was in the 86th Division, which was one of the last two divisions to be sent to Europe. They were supposed to go to the Pacific, but they got sent to the Battle of the Bulge. So they were in Europe when Japan surrendered, and then they were the first division sent home to the United States. By that time, they had already lost men, and they had to try and find new packages of infantrymen to sort of fill out these units, and then they were going to be shipped out to the Pacific, right? And you had all this churning, all this movement back and forth across the Atlantic and the Pacific that was tying up shipping just with trying to sort of get the demobilized soldiers home. And on top of that, then you had to bring these other troops, which were going to be redeployed from Europe in preparation for the invasion of Japan. That was also clogging up American rail lines at the same time. So this whole problem of troop movement was a serious obstacle, and the Army was behind from day one and was trying to catch up during this whole period, during the summer of 1945. On top of that, there was growing concern that if the government didn't begin economic reconversion soon, the United States would face economic disaster if the war suddenly ended, if they had not begun to reconvert to a peacetime economy. And so Harry Truman was getting dire warnings from everybody involved in mobilization agencies about the need to sort of begin this process of economic reconversion. The problem was the Army was not willing to sort of compromise on its plans for the invasion of Japan. And that meant it was sort of monopolizing the economy, and they were unwilling to release soldiers who might be needed to help with the reconversion, for example, miners, but also people, locomotive engineers, that kind of thing, skilled workers who were needed, they thought, to begin this economic transformation. But the Army was just, they would not relent, right? They were focused on the invasion of Japan, understandably. So you had this problem then of kind of reconversion, redeployment in the midst of fighting the Japanese on Okinawa and trying to prepare for the invasion of Japan. And then, of course, the Americans discovered, much to their dismay, that the Japanese had anticipated the invasion of Kyushu, the southernmost island, which would be the first part of that Operation Downfall, the invasion of Japan. And they had not only anticipated, but they had pushed far more troops into Kyushu than the Americans thought possible. So now you face a prospect of a kind of out of sorts military trying to land on one of Japan's home islands and confronting many more troops than they had anticipated originally, right? And on top of that, you have the problem, some people believed it was a problem, of the Soviet Union, which was preparing to invade Manchuria in the northeast of China. But some Americans were worried that when the Russians got into the war, they wouldn't stop at Manchuria. And that while the Americans were tied up trying to battle over Kyushu, the Russians would have their way in China and be able to take advantage of the Americans. Plus, moving troops from Europe, and Winston Churchill worried about this, would weaken the Western Allies' presence in Central Europe as well. And so there were, Americans were trying to finish the war with Japan, but some people in the administration were worried about what would become the Cold War. They were already thinking past Japan and wondering how American strategy might be working to the benefit inadvertently of the Russians, right? And so you had all these kind of looming catastrophes building, and modification of unconditional surrender seemed to hold out the possibility that you could solve all these problems if you could just get the Japanese to surrender, which of course is what the Japanese were hoping would happen, is that the Americans would abandon unconditional surrender and enter into negotiations with the Japanese. And the Japanese came, I think, surprisingly close to achieving that. There was, in the summer of 1945 in the United States, a furious public debate over the policy of unconditional surrender. It was very partisan. It was very ideological. The people arguing for modification of unconditional surrender were conservative Republicans. And the people who were arguing to defend unconditional surrender as American policy tended to be New Deal liberals. And so you really saw a kind of partisan debate break out at the end of World War II. And I think a lot of people have been unaware of that, that political dispute, which broke into the open in the summer of 1945. And that's sort of, I talk about the dimensions of that dispute in the book and how it turned out. So I'll leave it there.
Excellent. Well, thank you. So it's interesting that policymakers were already thinking about the Cold War before the hot war even ended. So, Marc, is this your explanation as to why FDR had made unconditional surrender the policy for the war?
Well, Roosevelt, as with most things, he had multiple reasons for doing it. And one was political. He had been Assistant Secretary of Navy at the end of World War I, and he remembered that Republicans were calling on Woodrow Wilson at that time to demand Germany's unconditional surrender. They used those terms, right? So and of course, Wilson didn't do that, right? He said they would have peace on the basis of the 14 points, and he was roundly criticized by Republicans for that. So fast forward, Roosevelt's president, and he realizes that the Republicans may call for unconditional surrender again, or he thought they might. And so he made that part of American policy. So that's one reason for that. Another reason was that in order to help ease American entry and British entry into North Africa, Roosevelt had been willing to compromise with the Vichy French government, right, in that area, what became known as Darlan deal, and leaving the Vichy French in charge. And he was roundly criticized, mostly by his own supporters, for compromising with the enemy, right, with the fascists. And that really stung him. And so another reason for declaring the policy of unconditional surrender then was to reassure his supporters that they weren't going to compromise with the Nazis or the Japanese, right? He also needed to communicate that to the Russians, who were already wondering if the Americans were going to see this war through to the end. And Roosevelt needed the Russians in the war. I mean, I think most of you are aware of how important the Red Army was to victory over Germany. And so he needed to assure Stalin that the Americans would not enter into a separate peace with the Germans. So unconditional served that purpose as well. The Joint Chiefs supported the policy because it was a clear objective, and they worried that the American people might become weary of the war, and therefore it was important to hold before them this sort of clear objective of total victory. And that was what the war was being fought for. And so the Joint Chiefs supported it. And then finally, I mean, Roosevelt and his advisors believed that, complete victory, total victory was necessary to prevent Germany, a resurgence of German or Japanese militarism, that you had to completely defeat and occupy the Axis powers so that you could get in there and tear, this autocracy and fascism out by the roots.
Right.
You can only do that through an occupation. So those were all the reasons for the policy.
Going back to the beginning of the war, Joe, there's a lot has been written that the American Navy was using older ships, older equipment, that it was difficult to get the American citizenry really behind mobilization and training, and the classic story of how the Marines and the construction workers on Wake Island managed to hold back the Japanese with a lot of very old equipment. How well were the troops on Guadalcanal trained and equipped? How quickly did they sort of turn things around, and did we get better training and better equipment for Guadalcanal, or did we not? Were they still using older equipment?
I think they were well trained enough. I mean, it was the 1st Marine Division. They had a history of winning, discipline, had a tradition. So that part was okay. I think they were well trained. Their equipment was pretty spotty, though.
Okay.
They were using weapons from World War I, 1903 Grand Rifle. A lot of them had those the flat hat helmets when they went into Guadalcanal, and old clothing. They weren't very well equipped. And then when they lost half of their gear on the transport sailing off, they were even worse off.
Wow. So they were really. What other disadvantages did they have? I mean, besides the fact that they had the entire Japanese Army, Navy, and Air Force after them, what other obstacles?
Yeah, that was they did, and they a lot of them despaired that they had been forgotten. However, they hung on. They had good leaders. I think that was the main thing. Their general Alexander Vangriff was an excellent commander, and all the way down through the regimental levels, they had people that had fought in the Banana Wars, and many of them had fought in World War I too. So that helped keep things together. But some of the other problems they had were environmental, actually. Guadalcanal is a tropical jungle, basically. And the climate was terrible. It rained every day. The Marines' clothing actually rotted off them after a while. Malaria, dysentery were just rampant. and the Marines didn't want to take the atabrine tablets because it turned their skin yellow. And then there was the belief that it made them sterile too. So they were reluctant to take atabrine. That was the best thing we had.
Looking at a global level, Marc, a certain percentage of the troops from Europe were demobilized or left stationed in Europe. What was the percentage of the troops that they had planned to send from Europe to the Pacific theater, and what was the thinking of the demobilization of the troops that they decided that we're going to send home?
Well, I never thought of it in terms of the percentages, but I would say at least a third. There were several. The expectation was that they would be moving several 100,000 men at least across the Pacific, and that's not counting the sort of engineer units, which would be going. They wouldn't stop in the United States. They were going directly to the Pacific because they were expected to build the bases and the piers and everything that was needed in order to accept the troops coming in, and also the shipping and the supplies that were going to be built up for the invasion. The thinking behind the partial demobilization was that it would be demanded on the home front, and it was a way of rewarding GIs for their continued service and for their valor. And in something that was really, it was very surprising. The most efficient way of doing that, of course, would be to just take units out of the line, right? Send a division home. But they polled the soldiers almost like they were a sort of a political constituency. And the soldiers, what they wanted was a system that recognized time in service, your time in a war zone, any medals that you had gotten. You got points for children at home. So you got 5 points for each child up to 3, and the 4th one wasn't worth anything to you. And you accumulated all these points. I have a copy of the card, if a mock-up, if you want to see it.
If you do have that.
Yeah, sure.
That's fascinating. That's fascinating.
I got to back up here. Okay, I've got it, and I'll share it. Wait a minute. Sorry.
That's okay.
Yeah, there it is.
Oh, there we go.
And this lucky fella is going home because he's got 110 points, right? Yeah. So number of months in the Army, then he gets overseas credit, then you get combat credit, and then there's the parenthood credit. Right?
Look at that. Son of a gun. How about that?
Yep.
Oh, that's interesting.
I've never seen that. I guess I had heard about that. So it really was sort of going into the units. It wasn't.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, it wasn't like this entire regiment is all going to go to the Pacific. It's depending on what your service levels were.
Well, and part of this was also being determined by the sort of campaign ribbons they gave out. And that was kind of a work in progress. So you had a situation where, a division, you had culled all of the troops who had 85 points had come out. And then all of a sudden, the Army awarded a campaign ribbon for I don't know what, but, pick one. And, one division, they lost 2,000 more men. And they'd had to they had to pull them out and try and replace them with other troops in Europe. Waldo, he wound up being like the senior NCO in his company, literally overnight. They had, everybody else got, and it became even more complicated because think about this: who's likely to have the most service? Those people who weren't directly in combat, probably the company clerks. And so a lot of the company clerks, the guys who kept the records for everybody else, they were getting pulled out.
How about that?
It was an administrative nightmare to execute this, but it was done because the GIs had requested it.
Okay, so going to the other side, Joe, tell us about the Special Attack Corps, the kamikazes. How did these guys end up in the Special Attack Corps? Were these volunteers? What was going on there?
They asked for volunteers initially, and they got them. They were enthusiastic. They all volunteered. First batch volunteered in the Philippines at Malacat Air Base. That's where it started. And they asked this one squadron for volunteers, and everybody stepped forward. And they continued that way for a while. But they were losing a lot of people. If you were in the Kamikaze Corps, it was very likely you weren't going to come back. The saying was, "Come back dead." So one of the commanders said. So by 1945, they were having trouble filling those ranks. And they wanted to keep the trained pilots available to actually man their fighter planes and carry out traditional missions. So one of the things they did was they drafted the college kids and they put them in the Kamikaze Corps. And so the Special Attack Corps became full of young guys from the universities. And they were very resentful. Many of them were. And to get ready for these missions, they would drink heavily.
Yeah.
And one of them even strafed the control tower on his way out. They were a resentful bunch. They didn't want to do it, a lot of them, but they made them do it.
Wow. Marc, going back to the this policy of unconditional surrender, what would you say is the biggest misconception about the policy?
Well, I think the way the war ends, because of course, the big issue in the summer of 1945 was whether the Americans would compromise and promise the emperor that he could stay on the throne. And Truman, despite being advised to do that by a lot of his closest advisors, including the Secretary of War, and his advisor on the Joint Chiefs, Admiral Leahy, Truman resisted that. He thought Hirohito was as guilty as Mussolini and Hitler. That wasn't quite right, but it was closer to the truth than what people around him believed. But so he never made that public pledge to keep the emperor. And then, of course, after the 2 atomic bombs, say they're going to surrender, but only if the prerogatives of the emperor remain intact. And Truman rejected that offer, but he said, the emperor's authority will be subject to that of the supreme commander for the Allied powers. So that implied that the emperor would stick around, right? But he would be subordinate to MacArthur. So a lot of people said, well, if he was willing to let him keep the emperor, he should have told them that sooner and the Japanese would have surrendered. But that's not really the— Just a moment. In Japanese. Sorry about that. That's not really the case. To begin with, the Japanese gave no indication that the emperor was the only issue holding up surrender. The military wanted to disarm itself. They wanted to try their own war criminals, and they said there would be no occupation of Japan's home islands, right? All those issues were non-starters for the Allies. But the other issue is that when Truman placed MacArthur above the emperor, he did so in a way that ultimately led to the transformation of the imperial institution. A lot of people said, well, the emperor, he's just a figurehead in Japan, right? But he wasn't. He was central to the whole Japanese system of governance, and the military reported directly to him. And so he had, the constitution he governed under had been modeled on the Prussian constitution with the Prussian emperor. So, I mean, he wasn't like the King of England or the Queen of England. He held a great deal more authority and, was this bulwark of, authoritarianism within the Japanese system. But when Truman put MacArthur over him, they ultimately did turn the emperor into that figurehead. And the Constitution actually reduced the emperor's role in Japanese society. The Windsors are like the richest family in England. The imperial family in Japan, they get a yearly salary. They get a budget that's voted by the Japanese parliament, the Diet. They don't own any property, right? They are completely separated from any kind of political involvement. And so Truman did not compromise on the goal of unconditional surrender. He got what he wanted, which was a transformed Japan. And it began with the transformation of the role of the emperor. And I think that even today, people don't understand how significant that was for Japanese society.
So we only have a couple of minutes left, but I'm curious, sticking with you, Marc, I'm curious then, why was unconditional surrender the policy? Why did it remain so controversial even after the war? I mean, after everything has been going on.
This is a strange story that gets even stranger. Those conservatives who opposed unconditional surrender, who were worried most about the Soviet Union, after the war, and after, of course, the communists come to power in China and you have the Korean War, they look at the situation in Asia and they said, well, none of this would have happened if we had compromised with the Japanese earlier, if we had negotiated some kind of settlement. And look, we left the emperor on the throne anyway. We could have done that. And they say, well, why didn't we? And the answer they come up with was, well, unconditional surrender was really a communist policy. The goal was to extend the war long enough so that you would get revolutionary turmoil in Japan and Soviet domination of Northeast Asia. And so they blame this on people that they identified as anybody who supported unconditional surrender in the government was characterized as a communist, sympathizer, or a dupe, or even an agent of the communists. And they made these accusations in congressional hearings. There's a whole raft of books written with this theme. And so this kind of conspiracy theory, you know, in the era of Joseph McCarthy is one of these themes that gets pushed all during this period. And aspect of that story, I think, that's been forgotten.
Wow. So you hear that my chime tells me it's 2 minutes before the top of the hour, but what I wanted, so excuse the Westminster chime while I ask Joe his last question. Joe, what are you working on now?
Working on a book on the Battle of Peleliu. During my presentation, I was described it as the first of the attritional battles the Japanese fought. And it was in September 1944. Smaller battle than Iwo Jima or Okinawa, but significant. And it's often forgotten because it was going on while MacArthur was invading the Philippines.
Interesting. Mark, how about you?
Well, for something completely different,
Ah.
I'm writing a family history of the Irwin family. They were a Philadelphia family, but Robert Walker Irwin went to Japan in the 1860s. He helped found what became Mitsui, married a Japanese woman. He had several children. One of his granddaughters, a woman named Yukiko Irwin, eventually came back to the United States, and she introduced Americans to this Japanese finger pressure called shiatsu. And you can look her up. Her book is the book on Japanese massage. But the more interesting part of this story is she is a descendant of Benjamin Franklin.
Oh, about that.
So you have this story of this is a Japanese-American saga beginning in Philadelphia and returning to the United States over a period of about 100 years. Anyway,
that's fascinating.
That's what I'm doing.
So, well, this is, as I said at the beginning of the show, I knew I was going to learn a lot, and I did. I really very much want to thank Marc Gallicchio, and in the chat, I presented you with his the URL for the website at Villanova. Of course, all you really need to do is just type in his name in Villanova, and you'll get him. You'll get his website, where you'll find the list of his books. Also, I provided you with the website for Joe Wheelan, and the bookshop.org website, so that you could see the books for our guests this evening. And I want to thank them both for not only their time this evening, but for all of their work that they put into presenting us with really fascinating narratives on what changed world history for sure. I have some terrific shows coming up on History Author Talks on May 18th. I have John Ferling, who's going to be talking about his new book, Winning Independence, which is the Southern campaign of the American Revolution, along with John Moss, who will be talking about Guilford Courthouse. And our guest host is Al Zambone, the biographer of Daniel Morgan. That's going to be a terrific show. On June 8th, I've got Revolutionary Waters, the Indispensable Privateers, with Patrick K. O'Donnell and his new book, The Indispensables, and Donald Chamet, who has written a fantastic book called Privateers of the Revolution. It's war off the New Jersey coast, and if that doesn't sound interesting, boy, I tell you, it's fascinating. Then on July 20th, I've got a few shows interspersed that I will also be posting, but on July 20th, I have a fascinating show with Annette Gordon-Reed, the author of The Hemmingses and of Monticello. And of course, she's just released her autobiography called Juneteenth. She's going to be joined by her friends, which include Andrew J. O'Shaughnessy, the author of a new book called The Illimitable Freedom of the Human Mind, about Thomas Jefferson. And he's also the author of The Men Who Lost America. And also Peter Onuf, who's Annette Gordon-Reed's co-author on a number of books, and including The Most Blessed of Patriarchs. So it's really a Thomas Jefferson evening with three of the top scholars on Thomas Jefferson. So those are just a few shows that I have coming up. You can see more at History Author Talks, along with videos from all of our past shows. And don't forget to visit me at 10crucialdays.org, which is my 501c3, where I'm giving tours of the Trenton and the Princeton campaigns of the American Revolution. Most of all, I want to thank all of you for joining me again. And I look forward to seeing you again at History Author Talks. Thank you all. Good night, everyone.
Good night. Thank you.